The Trump administration's policy of separating families at the border sparked outrage and may have seemed unprecedented. But throughout American history, authorities have cited a variety of reasons for breaking up families.
The Associated Press explains several times in our nation's history when families were separated. It happened to African Americans during slavery, before abolition, Native Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries, and Japanese Americans during World War II. Kenneth Davis is the author of Don't Know Much About History, a wonderful series of books. I urge our viewers to check them out, and he is joining us here today. Good to see you.
Good morning. I wish it were a happier subject that we were discussing.
Yes, indeed. And the way Anne-Marie phrased it, which is that you've heard a lot of people saying on social media, in the news, this is not America, this is un-American. In fact, Bruce Springsteen, during his Broadway show on Sunday, said what we're seeing at the U.S. border is un-American. But in this great country that we love, there have been many moments in history when this has happened, and past this prologue.
Unfortunately, it has a long and very tragic history, and I don't think there's any history that's more tragic than the notion of the destruction of the family, and we have to start then when we talk about that with slavery. George Washington, the father of our country, auctioned off children away from their parents in 1769. It's documented. He wanted to make money. He had to recover debts from someone, so he sold off children from their parents. That's the father of our country. The famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass talks about in his narrative being taken from his mother when he's 7 months old and really never seeing her again. So this is the history of what African Americans were dealt with, how they were dealt with for centuries in this country, leading in many ways to the destruction of the family. You mentioned the Native American history. That begins primarily as a government function after the Civil War, and it's out of goodness of their hearts, in a sense, that we're going to take the savage away from their terrible circumstances and give them new names, give them haircuts so they look like us, put them in our clothes, teach them English, teach them Christianity so they won't be savage. And that policy continued for 100 years. Perhaps the most famous example, Jim Thorpe, removed from his family, taken to the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, the most famous of those schools. Very often they were work camps. They were called schools, but many, many of these children died and never saw their parents again.
And, you know, most recently now, we've seen people compare what they're seeing at the border, particularly when they saw the tents set up, to the period of Japanese internment here. Do you see similarities? Do you see echoes?
Well, of course. The difference is that children weren't necessarily removed from parents. Whole families were stripped of their homes, their businesses, their livelihoods during World War II under this terrible internment policy, which was under the guise of national security. So that's the connection I see between that situation and this. But it was still a destruction of the family, in a sense, and these children were in camps, in schools, also being sort of made American in the eyes of the government at the time. So in those senses, it is a similarity, but also done under the guise of protecting the country from a threat that did not exist.
And what was the reaction like then from the public? Because, you know, it just occurred to me that, you know, this is a period of war that they were dealing with, but some of the phrasing that we're hearing, right, about immigrants coming over the border, you know, whether it's infestation or invading or whatever, there are images of the other taking over.
That's a much older story than World War II, of course,
right.
But most Americans certainly would have agreed with the policy during World War II because of the situation. But you can go back to the time of Benjamin Franklin, before America was the United States of America, where he was worried about immigrants who were coming in and speaking their own language, and they were criminals, and they were putting up signs in their own language. He was talking about Germans in Pennsylvania in the 1750s. Then we had the Irish, who were the dirty, diseased, dangerous ones who were coming. Centuries of discrimination against Irish immigrants. So that's another piece of this myth of the melting pot that we have.
You know, it's interesting when you listen to the politicians and they talk about this. Kirstjen Nielsen, the Department of Homeland Secretary, you know, she over and over again repeated that the laws had to change, that her hands were tied. Well, we saw yesterday the president untie those hands and change the policy through executive order. Throughout history, slavery, what you talked about with regards to Native Americans, that was the law. Just because something is the law doesn't make it right. No. And we would think that in 2018 we have moved beyond that by just saying, well, it's the law, so we have to enforce it. Just because it's the law doesn't necessarily make it right or make it even, it's not, you point out, Mary, it has been part of America's history, but we don't have to repeat that history.
Mm-hmm. No, look, slavery was built into the United States Constitution.
Right.
So it was legal, it was not moral, and there were certainly people who complained about it being immoral. They were a small fringe group for most of our history. So there's always been the case that what is legal is not necessarily right, just, or certainly all of the Jim Crow laws
right.
of post-Civil War America were legal, but they were not moral. They were not right, they were not just. And so we like to believe that we are on this progression in this country, that we were moving towards the ideals that Thomas Jefferson wrote about in 1776. And by the way, of course, Monticello has just opened up
yes.
Sally Hemings's room, which is adjacent to Thomas Jefferson's room. Sally Hemings's children, they got to live with her and stay there and remain there, but they didn't know and could not acknowledge who their father was. Mm-hmm. Now Monticello is acknowledging that Thomas Jefferson indeed was their father.
And we should end this segment by saying that it's something you pointed out, Anne-Marie, during the commercial break, which is, unlike some of the other countries which have experienced much the same that we have experienced here, there has always been an ideal. That's what makes America so great. That's what makes America a wonderful place, which is sometimes things happen, and yet we as a people have always tried to elevate where we have come from. And when we've noticed or when we've realized that something was wrong, we've tried to fix it. And that is what is uniquely, in my opinion, uniquely American about our ideals.
Well, there's another side of that.
I'm trying to end it on an uplifting.
There's also been the notion that once you're here, you pull up the ladder.
Well,
and
yes.
that's part of our tradition as well. And I'm not just trying to throw cold water on what you're saying. I believe in that ideal. I think we teach that to our children, but our history has not shown that we really carried that, have carried that out. And certainly the idea that foreigners, immigrants, it has been part of our history and our tradition from before we were America, as I mentioned, and it's certainly continued today with questions of religion, of national origin becoming the thing that makes someone the other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, we are not even, we've talked about what some of these children are going to go through being separated from their parents. I did a piece for the CBS Evening News where families who had been ripped apart during slavery, once abolition happened, the emancipation, they put ads in newspapers called information wanted ads, where they were searching for either their children or their parents, mm-hmm. and the physical and the mental scars that these individuals suffered throughout the rest of their lives, being separated from their families, were never ever healed.
Well, Kenneth talked about the breakup of the African American family, and we've been having conversations about the psychological impact for these children being pulled away from their families. And at this point, we don't know how long it will be, and some may never see their parents again, particularly if they get deported.
Yes, and the simplistic notion when it comes to slavery that, oh, that ended 150 years ago, and those attitudes were cemented into our society, into our laws, into our legal system, into our attitudes, and they pervaded for many, many centuries and still pervade today. That's why most sociologists will tell you that that was the greatest tragedy of slavery, the destruction of the African American family.
Yeah.
Such a great discussion. Thank you, Kenneth.
Sobering view of our history here.
Check out the Don't Know Much About History books that Kenneth has written. They are amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.